So, this past Saturday on WFMU, Bob Brainin played a rehearsal outtake by the band Little Feat from their first album that was released in 1970. The song he played was Hamburger Midnight, which was this, I guess you could call it almost a musing or recitation of some late night stoners looking for food. And it's a funny song. And like most of the music on that album, it's all over the place. They hadn't really codified a singular style yet. So it's a very interesting crazy quilt of all sorts of stuff. Well, it's decidedly different than the version that's recorded on their debut album. And so it really made me take notice. I had never heard it before. I have no idea how he got a hold of this. I saw Little Feat for the first time in April of 1971 when I was 15 years old. They had just released their first album, and they were relatively unknown. I saw them when they were opening for Johnny Winter at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium. It was the first day of Easter vacation, so there was a real festive party mood in the place, you might say. And along with the Jay Giles Band, which was also on the bill that night, they alone were very, very different because what all the bands had in common was, like a lot of bands in the early 70s, they were playing kind of a version of blues rock boogie music that you really don't hear very much of anymore, especially on WFMU. And I can understand why. I mean, that style of music, of all the types of music in the 70s that are now being reconsidered, that's kind of the outlier. That's not one that many people have picked up on. Well, right from the jump, seeing them live, and I knew nothing about them. I could tell that there was something decidedly different. They seemed to be playing in a very asymmetrical style, very strange time signatures. And back in those early concerts, you would sometimes get little programs that would explain, talk about a little synopsis of the band, and it indicated that two of the guys, Lowell George and Roy Estrada, had formerly been in the Mothers of Invention with Frank Zappa. And that intrigued me because I really liked the Mothers of Invention. About 6 months later, I remember this so clearly, school had just started. It was fall of 1971, and I literally used to run home from school to listen to this DJ. Her name was Outrageous Nevada on KPPC in Pasadena, which was the local freeform station. Well, this was a Friday afternoon, and she said, well, there's going to be this free concert tomorrow where Little Feat are going to play. So my sister, her friend Kathy, who had a 1963 Chevy Bel Air, and our friend Mike Foster went to the show the next day. And it was in the afternoon, and it was at a shopping center of all places. But it was outside. This was not a mall. This was a all the stores were outside, and they had kind of a walkway in between them. And they had a riser set up where the band was playing. And we got there, and they had already started playing. And there was like probably about, at the very most, like 50 kids, watching the band. And all these sort of confused older people walking by like, what the hell is this? Well, it was really great because we were literally in front of the band. I mean, I distinctly remember standing right in front of Lowell George, who was playing a white Stratocaster with a slide, and like watching him right up close. And they took a little break, and Roy Estrada, the bass player, and I remember how he looked so clearly. He was wearing striped, like wool striped slacks. And he was wearing like a Mexican serape. I went up to Roy, and having known that he was in the Mothers of Invention, I asked him, do you guys do Dog Breath in the Year of the Plague? And he was a real nice guy, and he just goes, no, that's another band's material. Well, and I don't know how that happened. Richie Hayward, who was the drummer, just it literally like a monkey falling out of the tree was right in front of me, and he was wearing mirrored aviator glasses, and he said, we'll play the song if you give me one joint, man. One joint. And I could see myself reflected in his mirrored aviators, and I'm sort of backing away in horror. Well, they had a pile of the albums because it was kind of a promotional thing. And my friend Mike got one. I didn't get one. And so he listened to it a couple of times and decided that he didn't really care for it. And so he traded me for my Blind Faith record. Well, I kind of fell down the rabbit hole with the record. I mean, I really, really liked it a whole lot. And it became at that time, when I had just turned 16 years old, it became one of a focal point for me. Well, a couple months later, their second album, Sailing Shoes, came out. And I remember getting an early promotional copy at Pooh Bar Records in Pasadena. And back in the day, all the records from Warner Brothers that were promos had like a pink and black sticker right on the front. And it was a real rainy afternoon. And taking this home, and once again, just falling down the rabbit hole with the records. I just loved the universe that they seem to have invented. I'm still piecing, and of course it's a Gatefold record, and all the lyrics are there. And to me, it seemed like the lyrics were closer to beat poetry than conventional song lyrics. I mean, my sister had started college, and one of her English books was this. It was a book called Voices of This Continent, where it was a compendium of all the best sort of American writing, prose and poetry. And there was this poem by Allen Ginsberg called A Supermarket in California, which is this ecstatic, Allen Ginsberg, so it's this ecstatic exaltation of, where he's in a supermarket, but he's having all these other fantastical thoughts. And in my mind, I remember imagining like a Safeway, like in Berkeley, and like where he's, ruminating. Well, we saw Little Feat again at the Santa Monica Civic a couple months later. And they were opening for Captain Beefheart. And this was another free concert that was put on by Warner Brothers. And when they came out, they were no longer a quartet. Roy Estrada was gone, and instead Kenny Gradney was the bass player, and also Paul Barrere was in the band, and Sam Clayton. The band that ultimately the band that defined who they were. Well, at that time, in the spring of 1972, they were still playing a lot of material from the first album, but it was also augmented by some new stuff. Well, this was kind of a very early introduction to that band because they essentially disappeared after that, and you never heard them again. They weren't playing around anymore. Well, in 1973, about a year later, Dixie Chicken came out, and then it was the full band, 6 members, and it was obvious that they were on a completely different mission. They had completely restructured the sound. They were essentially a different band. They sounded different. They had different kinds of songs with a different point of view. And it was good. It was compelling. But it wasn't what was going on in those first 2 records, which was, to me, it was a different type of thing. It was more outwardly, exuberant, the music. It was more like boogie music, with a New Orleans flavor. Well, I continued to see them, whenever they would play around, and they played around a lot at that point. They were starting to really gain momentum again. And a couple years later, I went to see them at the Fox Theater in Venice. And I had done an illustration of one of their songs from Dixie Chicken called Fat Man in the Bathtub, which to me exemplified kind of this point of view that Lowell George had. It was to me, it was like one of the standout songs, and it was very funny. I mean, it was kind of like, well, for lack of a better description, I mean, the song was a cartoon. So I did a drawing, a watercolor drawing of the song, and I took it with me that night. And after the show was over, and I was standing in the lobby, I had already made up my mind that I was going to somehow get this to Lowell George. I saw one of their roadies, who was this big burly biker guy, and I walked up to him and I said, "Here, give this to Lowell George." And he kind of studied it for a minute, looked really serious, and he goes, "You wait here." And so he disappeared. And shortly thereafter, Lowell George came out, and he walked straight up to me, and he shook my hand very vigorously. But what I remember mostly, because we're both eye level, and he's really close to me, and looking at his eyes, which were these, he kind of made me think of a Stepford wife, when they just have dark pupils and irises and there's no white. His eyes were so dark. Well, he had a backstage pass for the show that night, like stickered on his Levi's, and he pulled it off and he slapped it on my chest. Then he disappeared. Well, I was so stunned that it never even occurred to me to go backstage and try and hang out with the band and all their other admirers. I just kind of like wandered out onto Lincoln Boulevard in a complete daze. Well, a few years later, Lowell died way too young. And at that point, the band continued, but I never saw them again. And looking back at their entire output, like with any performer, that has like a long running career. There's an arc, you know, that any close listening will show you what their high and low points were, and Little Feat are no different. I mean, a lot of their later stuff I have no interest in whatsoever, but these first two albums, I listened to them on the CD player in my truck, which has a good sound system. You know, and it has like speakers in the door panels and speakers pointed directly at my ears. And there's a lot of, you know, information there that I could have missed the first time around. And so those records are still, they can't be like, of course, nothing is like it was at the beginning, but they're still ultimately very fascinating records to me because they are the product for me of a very, when I was like 15 and 16 years old, when I was just starting to go and see live bands. And so at that point in your life, I think that when everything is so brand new, you know, it can never be that way again. And everyone has different experiences, and our tastes change. And the world of music has evolved to the point that everything, you know, it's this constantly expanding universe that someone that I think that would pick up those records now could never really understand the context that they came out in. What life was like in the early 70s. And so I'm just very happy that Bob played this, because now I know there's this stuff out there, because there's really scant little of that first band. You know, it just doesn't exist. And that's just the way, you know, unless you were like a lot of bands that recorded everything they did, you know, all their shows, you know, it's just lost to time. And you just have to say, no, really, people, it really, really was unique. It was really good. And there were a couple other people on the comment board the other day on WFMU and Bob's program who also were touched by this. But it's, for all intents and purposes, it's not something that a lot of people are going to relate to. But I love it because I was there when it was happening in real time. And that's something that all your high definition video can't recapture.